Hello. In this video, we're going to go over some things that will help you with your next video project, the appropriation or desktop cinema project. So you've already been introduced to Premiere, but we're going to kind of build on top of that when you're working with what you might call mixed media, media of different types. So we're going to go over media management again, talk about file types, codecs, and resolution. And then I'm going to kind of go into Premiere and start off with some of the core like sequence settings and how you're going to do that when you're working with this specific type of mixed media as opposed to a bunch of similar HD files from a camera, for example. And then we're going to go over a series of different tips and things that might benefit you as you work on this project, including how to resize videos, cropping, dealing with like speed, effects, and other kind of very common things that are built into Premiere. You can see the list here. So let's go ahead and get started. Why don't you kind of open Premiere and you can follow along with this if you like. First thing first, when you open Premiere, I'm going to start a new project. And again, every time you start a project in Premiere, you're going to need to sort of tell it where to save and also what it should be called. So I'm going to call this appropriation demo, and I'm going to save it to a folder on my desktop that I've set up. And this is where I want to encourage you all to sort of keep practicing good media management, where you organize the files you're working with clearly and you put them in some place very specific. So right now mine is on my desktop, but you might want to put yours in your documents folder inside of like a folder that is specific to this project. And again, I kind of separate mine into images and sound, but I'm also going to make a new folder specifically for my Premiere files. And I'm going to choose that as my scratch disks. So everything I send and save in Premiere is going to be saved in that specific place. And again, just check your scratch disks tab and make sure they all say same as project. And then you should have a new project here. But before we go into that, again, I told you I have a folder, my appropriation folder, and I've separated that into images. And that's going to be for this like demo, I'm going to be showing you the variety of file types and codecs and things like that that you'll be using. So you can see I have here some MP4s, some PNGs, some JPEGs, a GIF, a .mov file, and so forth. I've also got a couple different audio tracks. And then here we can also see my Premiere file. Project files already been saved. So just kind of like, again, get into that habit. And then when you're done editing for the day, you could just take this folder and add it to an external hard drive and back it up. You can kind of also keep adding material to these folders as you keep working. So back to Premiere. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set up my workspace to the default for editing. That will probably be the case for you all already, but maybe not. So first thing I want to do is kind of just talk for a second about file types, codecs, and resolution. So for this project, you're probably going to be working with unusual or a variety of file types. And those file types are going to all have different codecs, they're going to have different resolutions, and they're going to come in different containers. So I just want to kind of touch quickly on these few terms. So a container, also known as a file type, is basically what holds the media. It's determined by a file extension. Here are some common ones for video, but also some not so common ones for video that we can actually use to edit with if we want, such as a PSD, Photoshop file, or TIFF or PNG. You could probably even edit PDFs and other things if you want, but Premiere doesn't accept everything, but it does accept many file formats and file types, and the best way to kind of know what to work with is through trial and error. The next kind of more invisible aspect of a lot of media is its codec. And codec is a kind of short term for compression, decompression. And this is what's happening under the hood to process the code or the data of these files. So for video, there's two primary codecs that you should be aware of. There's actually many codecs, but for our purposes, two common ones to know about are H.264 and ProRes 422. Now just briefly, in case you don't already know, H.264 is a codec that you find with a lot of web stuff. It has what you might say a lot of compression or high compression, but still results in good quality video files. Versus ProRes, which actually has very little compression and of course results in high quality files. The difference is with H.264 you get smaller file sizes, which is why it's good for the web. Whereas with ProRes you get higher file sizes, which is why typically you would use this if you're screening in like a gallery or a cinema. Things where quality is really not so much limited by compression and bandwidth and internet signals and things like that. And then finally, our video resolution or size. You might know already that for HD video, full HD is 1920 by 1080. And this is measuring the pixels width times height in a video file. And of course, the more pixels, the more resolution and the better quality. Another HD resolution is 720 by 1280. And this is more for web, but also, you see this out in museums and galleries, it's fine. And then of course, there are some other resolutions which we don't find so much with cameras these days because they're standard definition, which is pre-HD formats. They have a different aspect ratio. It's more square than HD 16 by 9 ratio. And also you can see that the pixel resolution is a lot smaller. 720 by 480 or 640 by 480 are kind of standard definitions. And then of course, when you're downloading stuff from YouTube, you might get a 320 by 240, which is actually very low resolution, but you still do find that out on the web. So back to Premiere. Once we have our files kind of collected and ready to go, we're going to go over to Premiere and import them. Now remember, with this project, we're going to have a bunch of mixed formats. And it's important that you kind of know what those formats are. So let's just go ahead, first of all, and import our footage. Here we go. And I'm just going to import, again, the images and the sound folder. And here we go. So if I look at the images I have, PNGs, JPEGs, and Photoshop files, they have a resolution of 255 by 253, a variety of mixed here. With my video files, I have some 720p, I have some kind of anomalous 320 by 480. One of these, I have a GIF here that's 700 by 394. I have a 1920 by 1080 full HD file, and I have a screen recording that's close to full HD, but not exactly. So I've kind of have a mixture here that I kind of included just to kind of show you how we're going to go ahead. So the key element before you begin editing is to decide what are your sequence settings going to be. So this is where we can go into Project, Sequence, and select from our default sequence preset. So you'll notice there is a DV standard. So if you were working with all SD footage that was maybe 720 by 480, you could actually just choose a standard definition project setting and work exclusively in that. But since I have some HD footage and I know that I want to make this an HD video when I'm finished, I have to make a decision. Should I be working at full HD, 1920 by 1080, or maybe should I be working at 720p? Still HD, but not full resolution. And I think for this project, since I have a variety of media and not much of it is full HD, I am going to choose 720p. And now Since I wasn't shooting with the camera, it's unlikely that I will have any 24p material. So I'm going to choose 720p 60 frames per second. And I'm just going to call this my 720 kind of sequence for appropriation. And I'm going to make that. And then it appears here. One thing you can do in Premiere is you can make multiple sequences. So let's say you begin working and you decide you want to go full HD. There's a couple ways you could do that. You could either export a full HD 1920 by 1080 video from your sequence, or you could make a new sequence that is full HD, copy and paste everything over, and just export that. But back to this. I set up my 720p sequence, and now let's just bring in this full HD. Uh-oh, it's a little glitched out here. Let's see. There we go. I've got this screen recording, which is bigger than 720p. So let me just drop it in here and see what happens. Again, I'm going to get this warning. And this is another thing you can do. Let's say that you have a variety of clips, but you know that one of them is 720p and you might want to edit in that sequence. You can choose to change your sequence settings. But again, if you set your sequence settings up with any intentionality, always select Keep Existing Sequence Settings. And one other thing to note about this is that the sequence settings inherent in a video clip may have different or unusual codecs. So when we select a DSLR codec, we know it's kind of digital video. It's going to be H.264 when we export. So it's always kind of good to go with an intentional setting. And if you're ever wondering what your sequence settings are, again, you can check sequence settings, and here is our DSLR, 60 frames a second, and it tells us our frame is 1280 by 720. Let's drop Snoop in here and kind of see what we get. So this is kind of common. This makes sense. I know that my Snoop Dogg clip is smaller than full HD, and this shows me its size in comparison to the 720p video I selected. So let's say I did want to make this full screen. I'm just going to zoom in on this clip a little bit. There's a couple ways to do that. If we double click our clip and go up to Effects Controls, don't forget we can use our motion controls here to change the scale of a clip. So this is pretty useful in resizing. I could also, using this area, position Snoop anywhere I wanted in the frame. Another good thing to keep in mind is if you just select the word motion over here, it activates this wireframe and you can click and drag wherever you want in the frame. So I'm going to undo these things. But let's say you don't want to mess with that too much and you just want like kind of an automatic way to resize this clip to be matching your frame. One way to do that is if you right click a clip, it opens up this menu with a lot of helpful options, such as unlinking the audio and the video and other things we'll get to later, changing the speed of a clip, etc. But if we come down here to set to frame size, this is a good way to automatically just make that clip appear full screen. Let me pull back up my Photoshop clip right here. And now again, I know that this is not exactly matched to the frame size, so I'm just going to right click and scale to frame size. And now I see my whole frame right here in my video. So there we go. I've got Photoshop and I've got me working on a Photoshop file in real time. So let's say that I would prefer to crop out the Photoshop interface and just have the image. So if I wanted to crop an image, in Premiere, they actually put that in the effects. So down here in your browser, media browser window, where you have a lot of things that you may have explored already, if you click Effects, this is where you're going to find a lot of effects. And the crop effect is under video effects. And now for me, if I know what I'm looking for, I'll just type in crop. and it pulls it up right there. But otherwise, you can go searching through here. It's a little bit confusing. You got to twirl down. But yeah, this is why I prefer the crop tool. So when I find the crop effect, I go over here and I drop it on to my video. You'll notice that nothing happened. And that's because anytime you add a filter or you want to make a change to a video, you need to double click it and go up to Effects Controls. And you'll notice now under this Effects Controls tab, the crop filter has appeared. And this is where I can crop an image. So you'll notice the wireframe, again, if I click the word crop, the wireframe makes itself visible, and I can drag this to be set wherever I want. I can also use the slider bar if that's preferred. But I like this, click and drag over here. All right, so now I've cropped out the Photoshop interface, and now I realize I want to go and change this a little bit. So I'm going to increase the scale. And now notice, you're increasing the scale, but it also increases, it includes the cropped area. So you're just going to need to do a little tweaking, and here we go. Sometimes if things get a little tight in your window, you can change, in your project window, you can change this fit to a different setting. So fit means it's going to show you your image to fill the frame. But if you go to 100, it's actually bigger, and you'll notice you can scroll up and down. This could be good for kind of doing some effect work if you need to zoom in, so to speak, on your final video. But I like to sometimes give myself a little extra space to see where my image is and just make sure I'm not kind of confusing my frames. So I want to just get this a little bit bigger. So I'm going to go to scale, and I'm going to use my up and down key to just increase this incrementally. And then there we go, and get that centered. All right. Now that I'm working, I'm just going to save. Remember, save early, save often. Now that I'm done with my crop tool, I'll clear that, and I'll go back to my project window where I can see all my clips. All right, so I've now cropped this video so I have a very specific area of it playing, but it is still 6 minutes. So I'm noticing that there's some sound on there. This is a screen recording, and I wasn't really paying attention to the sound, so I'm going to get rid of this sound, click this clip, and again, unlink. So now I have audio and video separate. I'm just going to delete the audio and keep the video. And now I'm going to speed this up. And there's a few ways you can speed up a clip. You can use the rate stretch tool, which is, where is it? It is hidden under here. Rate stretch tool is a kind of fast and easy way to just take a video and sort of change its speed based on its length in your timeline. It's a little bit, you don't know exactly what you're going to get, but it tells you here. I ended up with 304% speed. So that's pretty fast. But if I undo that, another way that you might want to work, or if you would want to reverse a clip, is to right-click a clip and change the speed under speed duration. And this is where you have a little bit more kind of controlled way to change the speed. If I change this to 600, it makes it 1 minute. And that's still kind of slow for what I want. So I'm going to change this to 1,000 and make it 40 seconds. And also note that if I wanted to, I could reverse the clip here and keep it 100%. And because there's no audio, this is deselected, but we'll come back to this in a second. So I'm just going to click OK. And now, there we have this clip sped up, looking pretty good. Not bad. All right, so I'm going to save that. All right, let's drop Snoop Dogg back in here. Actually, he's already in there. So I'm just going to delete that.
Message from Big Snoop Deal Double G to all the university students. Yeah, syllabus. You gotta do it. You gotta read it.
All right, so I want to demonstrate a helpful tool if you're speeding or slowing things in relationship to sound. So you'll notice, let's just maybe I'll say 300%. So speed this up. If I click maintain audio pitch, it will leave the audio sounding more, quote, normal than if I didn't. So let's hear what this sounds like. So it might be illegible or inaudible, but it still sounds like a human speaking and not a chipmunk, right? So if, just for the sake of demonstration, if I speed this up again to 300% and I do not select maintain audio pitch, let's hear what that sounds like. Right? So I find that by coming down here and changing speed duration here, you get a bonus control over the audio through this way instead of using the rate stretch tool. But I will leave it as is. Okay, let's dig into the Effects Controls tab in our preview window. So for that, I'm going to choose this image of a full moon. And I can tell that this full moon image is quite long. I forget what I have my still image duration at, something like maybe 10 seconds. Let me drop it into my timeline here. It is 10 seconds, yes. So again, I can see that when I dropped it in, it is definitely getting cut off. So I'm going to go to scale to frame size, and there is the image fitting nicely into my image. And of course, right now it's kind of hanging over this other image, so I'm just going to push this out of the way and just have this there. And I'm going to extend this a little bit longer. I'm going to zoom in and put this here. So one important note is that this Effects Controls tab shows you all the filters and motion controls and other effects that any clip in your timeline has. It doesn't apply to files in your browser. It's specifically meant for clips in your timeline. And so when you double click a clip in your timeline, you can edit it. For instance, I can change the duration, and you see how that, me extending the duration, this out point, makes it longer in the sequence. I'm going to undo that. But most importantly, let's focus in here on Effects tab, the Effects Controls. So we already talked about how I can change the position of this image. I can change the scale. I can make it a not uniform width. I could, for instance, squish or stretch the image, but typically you want that. It keeps the aspect ratio uniform, specific. We can rotate an image. We have that there. Anchor point is, specifically the anchor point refers to the center of an image. So if I move the anchor point over here and then I rotate the image, it's going to rotate on that anchor point. So really you don't mess with the anchor point too much, but sometimes you might move the anchor point like somewhere up into the corner, for instance, so we can do some kind of interesting rotation. I'm going to undo all that and put it back in the center. Opacity, we already talked about how opacity is controlled here. There's a wireframe with the pen tool. We can kind of create fades in and out of our image. So for instance, we can have the moon fade in. Actually, we'll leave that there, why not, right? But we also have opacity controls up here in the Effects Controls tab. And essentially, you have the same control up here as you do down here. But one thing I do want to come back to is this blend mode. And for instance, if let's say I stretch this image out. One good thing about images is that you can make them as long or short as you want. They're sort of infinite in their potential, which is really nice. But, so right now, I have the moon at 100 after it fades in over Snoop Dogg, and underneath it is some images of Snoop Dogg. But you'll notice on this blend mode, when it's normal, it's sort of what it implies. But if I want to sort of layer two images on top of each other, there's a bunch of options which can be really fun and potentially like helpful for you to use. For instance, it sort of acts as like a signal path where it will kind of deal with the opacity in a very specific way, depending on what setting you're using. So they each have some nuance. Here we have Snoop in the moon, which is kind of nice. She's sort of like that.
I know all about it.
But let's just put that back to normal for us. Where'd you go? There we go. For right now. So that can be really helpful for you all to use. Okay, so that is the basics of the effects controls that kind of are built into every clip. What I want to show you now is sort of how to animate these effects. So let's take our moon here. I'm actually going to get rid of these wireframes. So if you decide you don't want a keyframe here, you can either just undo it, or if I right click the keyframe, I can delete and delete. And now what I want to do is, let's say I want this moon to kind of like zoom in or out. As I mentioned, I can adjust the scale of this moon. It's pretty decent high-res photo. But if I want this to kind of, let's say I want this to sort of emerge out of nowhere. The way that we animate these effects are actually easier than you might think. So notice up here in our effects tab, we also have a little timeline. It's a little bit more cramped. Sometimes we can give ourselves a little bit more space just by bringing our cursor down to an area where it's blank. And the clip we see here equals the clip we see here. You can see that. So anytime you want to animate keyframes, activate the little toggle animation switch. It looks like a stopwatch. But once you click this button, wherever your cursor is, it's going to make a keyframe. So watch this. So there we go. I made a keyframe and it's at 100%. And now as I move this ahead, let's say that I am pacing out a sort of slow zoom into my moon. If I play this out and I'm like, okay, I want this zoom to kind of happen over this amount of time, if I now change the scale, it automatically makes a keyframe for me. So now you can kind of see what that's going to look like. And if you decide you want to play faster, you just move that keyframe closer. All right. And now anytime that you make a change in here, it's going to make a new keyframe. Not very helpful right here, but again, these are all editable. So if I use these buttons, it takes me from one keyframe to the next. So I could, if I wanted to edit a specific keyframe, I could put my cursor on it and then change that, and it actually makes the changes. If I want to just delete these keyframes, they get deleted. All right? Let's say I just want this epic zoom in, and I want to start at the beginning of my clip, and I want it to start at 0, and I want it to kind of come in to be epically huge. But I also want my clip to sort of be, the moon to be centered. So again, I can come over here to my position and just put this in a place that I like. And here we have the moon kind of coming in from the center. And that's because the moon is off center. Well, let's say I'm trying to get this moon to stay dead center in the frame. We can do the same thing, keyframing the position. So I'm going to activate my keyframe. Then I'm going to kind of keep moving this and keep it so that the moon is centered as my zoom increases. All right, so that looks not bad. I could even kind of make it dramatic if I wanted to. I could have the moon sort of like swinging in if I wanted to, kind of coming over here and coming back. But you can kind of see the benefits here for animation. This is not very pretty, but you get the point. And then the animation stays for the rest of the image, and I can reduce my clip length, since I probably won't need that much. All right. So basic keyframing with the motion tool under effects controls. This kind of keyframing will work for any type of effect that we add. We could, for instance, we used the crop tool earlier, we could animate a crop if we wanted. You can animate anything once you kind of get this basic principle down. Another cool thing that you have inside the effects controls built in under opacity is the ability to make a mask. So if we were layering images, let's say I'm going to find my pizza launch here. I don't want this audio, so I'm just going to drag the video. All right, I'm going to get rid of this area. Now, let's say that I wanted to crop out this Earth and replace it with the moon. I'll double click this clip again because it brings this specific clip up to the effects controls. And now I can make a mask that's either default shape with like a circle, square, or a freehand drawn one. And you'll see what happened as soon as I selected it. And it just inserted it here. And now I'm kind of drawing the mask based on these points. Now right now there's nothing below or above it. So if I was to go ahead and, again, take this moon image, maybe extend it underneath, now you can kind of see what I'm working with here. And you'll see it listed here as mask 1. If I want to edit it, I just come back into there and do that. You can invert a mask. You can create its feather, so it looks a little bit more mystical, right? But again, what I want to do is I want to come back and delete that mask and just quickly draw one. And this is, again, where I'm going to kind of come in here. I might want to zoom in to 150, give myself a little bit more control. You kind of see what I'm doing here. Closer in you get, the more detail you have. All right, and now you're going to need to close off your mask. And I always like to just bring it off. And now we have that. Let's go to fit. And kind of enjoying the little weird little thing I got going on here. Not exactly sure what it is, but it's not bad. And if I wanted to, kind of move it over here, it kind of works with this animation, like this pizza is approaching the moon, and wow, I don't even know what to say. But actually looking at this, I kind of think it should keep going, so I'm going to kind of come back in here and find the last keyframe and just increase it so it's full screen, and then just move over my moon here. And since I don't want this to be so rushed, I might slow it down. Wow, such a masterpiece. And now I might even say it needs to keep going. Just keep going. Just keep pushing it. And I'll just use my blade tool there, cut that, and we're done. We're done. Cool.
Go.
And actually, just real quick, because I can't not let this go, I got to get rid of this mask feather. I want a nice hard edge. All right, let's look at this GIF. What do we got? Let's drop this GIF in our timeline. Not bad. It's pretty chill. It's pretty small. I can see the scale here. But let's say I wanted to kind of take this and loop it. Now if I copy paste this and I just make a loop right here, not perfect, but whatever, I'm okay with it. But let's say now I've got this loop, and instead of having to make changes to all of these, like, because let's say I was editing and I forgot to resize this, you could do a couple things. You could select these all and then scale the frame size as 1, or this is something that you might find helpful if you're doing like a very tight sequence you're editing and you don't want to kind of like mess anything up. There could even be audio included. But if you have a bunch of things selected and you right click on them while they're selected and choose nest, you'll get this option, nested sequence. And what a nested sequence is just a bunch of clips put together almost into their own sequence so that they act as one unit instead of a series of individual clips. So I'm going to call this Horizon Nest. And now look what happened. It made one clip. And now when I come over to effects controls, if I change the scale, or if I want it to sort of do anything fancy for me, I don't have to make these changes and try to deal with them individually. I've kind of created a new clip out of them. So we have them all together, and this would be for another instance where I might want to kind of animate its position, for instance, starting at the beginning. If I want to create a new keyframe without making any change, what you might call a hold, you click this button and it just sets whatever you have as a keyframe so that you can go ahead and keep animating. And if you don't like the way it looks, you can just get rid of that holded keyframe and maybe push this here. Another example of keyframing effects with a nested sequence. And you'll notice the nested sequence is also now over here. And if you double click it, you can see its original parts and you can come back and edit it in case you want to make changes. So these nested sequences are very helpful. And this idea of working in multiple sequences is going to be something that I would advocate for. It is very helpful. All right, so I just want to quickly demonstrate the power of a PNG file. And as I mentioned, they retain transparency. So here we can see that I place this PNG over any clip. Oops, it will appear simply as is. And you can layer as many images or PNGs as you want on top of each other. And move these around, kind of like a little mini version of Photoshop. You can animate them if you want. Like for instance, I could just take this COVID and sort of just have it be rotating. Through space, and you get the idea here. One thing to keep in mind is you're not going to see the changes you're making to a clip unless you have the playhead over it. Another trick is if you double click in the area of a video, you can highlight it and then just drag and drop it around, which could be helpful. All right, so I'm going to speed up this shot of me editing. And now let's say that I would want to maybe potentially import a Photoshop file. Since I'm recording myself with a Photoshop file here, I might want to bring in this Photoshop file or another one. Working in between Photoshop and Premiere is actually pretty handy. It's not something you'll do every day, but because it's part of the Adobe suite, you can actually bring it into Photoshop, make changes in Photoshop, editing in Premiere, and those things will kind of speak back and forth. So let's say I do want to bring in a new file, whether it's a Photoshop file or something else. Remember, media management, best practices, always put items that you're working with in one spot. And I just dump this back into my images folder. And now I'm going to kind of come back to Premiere, File, Import, or Command I, and I'm going to find that file I just dumped in there, the Photoshop file, and I'm going to import it. One thing that Photoshop files have that others don't is the ability to kind of control layers. So for example, when you import a Photoshop file, it will ask you, do you want to merge all layers? And actually, you do not. Well, you might if you would just want it as a single image, but part of the benefit of working with Photoshop is being able to access all the layers. So you would want to import individual layers, and only layers that are visible in your project are going to be selected. You can also select layers that are invisible, or you could even deselect layers that are visible. Basically, you're telling Photoshop what layers to include. And now I want to include all my layers, so I'm just going to click OK. And now you'll notice what you get is your Photoshop file comes in as a folder where each layer is its own image. All right, so that's kind of cool. So what you see here is actually deconstructed here. And if you want to bring it all in as once, you'll notice it makes each layer its own video clip, so you'll just have to rearrange them a little bit by deciding what layer hierarchy you want, and then just put them all in a row and extending them for the duration that you prefer. And then this would also be where you could set them to the frame size you're working with. All right, so you'll notice that because in Photoshop I made certain parts transparent, you can now see where that's coming into play. So you can kind of do some cool collage style stuff with these videos. And let's say I'm editing and I don't want to get rid of the sound, I'll just mute it. That way it's not coming up and not appearing in my timeline, but I'm still kind of hearing it. So yeah, not bad. And then I can kind of sort of animate this in a way where, like, if I wanted to make a joke about Supreme and Supreme Court, again, I could just increase my track, use my pen tool, and fade in my Supreme logo. All right, and now this could be another example of where I want to nest these into a single clip. All right, one other thing to talk about is color correction. And maybe I'll bring back this clip. All right, so color correction is under effects, not color correction, but color control, I guess you might call it. Under video effects, color correction, I guess correction can be read broadly, but color balance, equalize, lumetri color, there's so many of these to play around with. The basics, brightness and contrast, change color, you might want to play around with these and just see what you get. Lumetri color is a pretty good basic color filter to play with. And basically it's meant for, I guess you might say it's meant for color correction, but if you look under color curves, you can really play with some of these RGB signals. And what I like about this is the visualization of it, where you kind of say, all right, I want to find the red, any red that's in this image, I'm going to play with it and push it or pull it or just let it be, right? Brightness is white, red is red, G, and B. So you can play around with this and really get some kind of cool effects. But I don't really like the way this is looking right now. So I'm going to go back into my curves and I am going to, there we go. You can get lost in here, it's kind of easy. I'm just going to click this reverse arrow. That's how we get back to where we were. Or if you're ever just so lost you can't figure out what to do, just highlight the filter and delete. And it's gone. No more filter there. So lumetri color is pretty good, but really take some time if you're interested in kind of color effects to play around with these. Color balance is a pretty kind of specific one where you can kind of get in here specifically with same kind of RGB kind of factors, but more specifically. So if you're trying to get like more of a blue kind of moody tint, you can sort of pump up the green and the blue shadows and just sort of like take out the reds and sort of push one or the other. But again, really the best way to play with these filters is trial and error. And let's say that you spend 30 minutes and you finally find the perfect color that you want, right? Instead of applying the same filter onto each clip one by one, here's a helpful trick or way of working that you might kind of refer to as copy and pasting attributes. So if you select the clip that you've been adding color correction to, and you hit Command C or Edit Copy, and then you go to another video clip and you hit right click and you want to, where'd you go? Hit Paste Attributes. And the attributes are the kind of information on top of the video itself, such as any of the motion, opacity, and filters you've been using. So here you can see the color balance filter is in here. So what I could do is paste specifically the color balance filter information onto other clips. But what I would not want to do is paste the motion attribute, because that, remember, is the scale. So I would deselect scale attributes, deselect motion, and leave effects color balance. If you have multiple effects, you'll have the ability to choose which specific ones you want. And if I click OK, maybe you noticed those effects got pasted into this new clip. So that way of copy pasting attributes can be super helpful. And you could go through and do it clip by clip by clip by clip. What's great about copy paste attributes is actually, in some ways, it allows you to copy paste so many things it could almost be overwhelming. So if you forget to, for instance, deselect a motion attribute when you resized one clip, that could sort of mess up what you did. So just be really careful when you're doing that. And like everything, just be paying attention to what you're doing and where it's happening. All right, so I'm just going to finish up real quick. I'm just going to kind of get this ready for us to export. All right, so I think I've got my masterpiece here. And I realized the one thing it needs is some music. This is some sound I glitched. Super pleasant, I know. Maybe I'll select this part right here. Just drop it in. And again, I'm going to want to kind of go in and open up my settings here. And I know this is going to be super loud, so I'm going to bring it way down. And I can look at my VU meter. And I want to just make sure my mix is okay here.
Big Snoop Bill Double G to all the university students. Yo, syllabus. You gotta do it. You gotta read it. Man, I'm telling you, the more you know, the further you go. Tell them Snoop Dogg sent you. Syllabus. I know all about it. Catch up so we can have a conversation. Don't be late. Let's go.
And maybe right there, since Snoop's done talking, I'm just going to kind of slowly raise my volume. All right, so that's working not too badly. And I just realized one thing I'm going to do is, because I haven't talked about audio effects, I want to end this piece with a little bit of reverb. So I'm just going to add an audio effect, but what I want to do is, because I don't want it to apply to the whole track, I'm going to do a sort of like cheap way of doing it. I'm just going to use my razor blade to cut right there, and I'm going to just cut a little area. And now when I add my audio filter, it's only going to go on this little part, and actually it's going to save me a little bit of time. So I want to just add some reverb. How about some studio reverb? Just drop it on here. Again, drop it on there. Same thing with the audio. Effects controls. And sometimes the audio effects in Premiere are not that great, but it's kind of hard to tell if it's actually doing anything. So I always just boost And because I want to sort of drop off, I'm just going to sort of have that increase and then drop off. And let that float through space. And now I feel satisfied that I can export my masterpiece. And again, because I want to have you start thinking about how to finish these projects in a very kind of professional way, let's go over here and select our track select tool and just give ourselves maybe like a few seconds of black at the beginning before we start our video. And the way I like to do this is just sort of like play the playhead for about a few seconds and feel it out.
Message from Big Snoop.
So maybe like I want to start my video here. So now,
Message from Big Snoop Double G.
that feels good. And now I've already got some built-in black at the end. And if I didn't have that there, I might go File, New, Black Video, and kind of insert it. Let me show you how there. Or maybe you want some bars and tone. This is a classic kind of video thing. And this would be under our project window. Bars and tone, just drop that in here. Kind of recognize this. Classic video. Up here, you'll find even more kind of tools that you find, like a color mat or a countdown leader, if you wanted to kind of include that. It's always kind of fun, right? But I'm not going to do that right now. And I'm just going to skip forward to exporting. We've done this before, you're familiar, but again, File, Export, Media. And you want to make sure that there's no in and out points in your sequence. You want to make sure there's not like one video selected, but that nothing is selected in your timeline. You want to make sure that it's set up. Preferably you've watched it and listened to it. And then we can go File, Export, Media. Now exporting is even more important when you're working with mixed media such as this project. So what we didn't talk about last time is the match sequence settings. This is something you can use if you are 100% sure your sequence settings are correct. So if I was to click this, it would actually set up a format MPEG preview. As soon as I see that, I do not like that. That's not something I want to use. And that's because I was working with all these mixed formats, so it's probably a little unconventional. But for our purposes, again, we talked about which codecs we like. We like QuickTime and we like H.264. And since I decided to edit in 720p, I'm going to export in 720p. And I can tell down here my video settings are already set to that, which is good. But again, so I can trust my preset to match my source with a high bitrate. If I wasn't sure, I could come down and again choose one of these YouTube or Vimeo settings. Those are always standard. I've never tried the Twitter ones or the mobile device ones or even these high quality ones. I'm not exactly sure what that's going to give you, but for our purposes, I would say Vimeo or YouTube that matches your sequence settings is going to be good. So I'm going to choose YouTube 720p HD. And then again, I can come down here and make sure that I see width times height is 720p. I can make sure that this looks about right over here on this side. I can also check to make sure that I've got square pixels. My bitrate settings are looking good. You can change this to VBR2 pass if you want a higher quality video. Might take a little bit of a longer export, but that's fine. You never hurts to hit maximum render quality. And also another thing to not forget is to name and set your export definition. So this is my 720 project, and I'm going to send it to my appropriation folder so that everything is together. one thing you can do is we talked about different codecs. If you wanted to kind of export an internet version for, like, say, YouTube, and you also wanted to export a second version that maybe tests these different presets, such as trying out this high quality 720p HD. It's kind of never hurts to do a comparison where you're sort of looking at both of the files each of these produce, and then, kind of like you learn from these processes, and then you start to figure out what's going to work best for you. And once you figure out a custom preset, you can even save that to your computer and sort of work with those. But that might be further down the road. But for right now, let's go ahead and choose YouTube 720p and send it out. And then we will be ready to go. So again, Premiere is always full of so many tools, so many menus, so many buttons. We're still just getting started, wading into the kind of wonderful world of Premiere. So hopefully this will be another resource for you to use. Enjoy the process of editing and embrace exploring everything Premiere can do.